Welcome to Board Game Binge, the place where we bring you bite-sized, bingeable board game content from across the industry. I'm your host, James Staley, and in this episode, we're chatting with Dan Wegiel, game designer for Holmgard Games, among others. His latest title, Lone Wolf: Vengeance of the Kai, is available now for late pledge on GameFound. Dan, welcome to the binge. How you doing, my friend?
I'm great. Thank you, James. Glad to be here today.
It is fantastic having you. We're just talking off air about this industry, and I know I'd asked you a little bit about GameFound and the decision to get into that. We're going to get into that later because I'm always excited to kind of have that debate about Kickstarter, GameFound, or even BackerKit or some of these others. So we will get into that. But first and foremost, Dan, where are you located? You're in the States somewhere?
Yeah, I'm in the States on the East Coast. I live right outside of Boston.
Oh, amazing! And how? And if you don't mind me asking, outside of games, what's your day job? What do you do?
Yeah, so I have to have a day job, obviously. But so I work at an investment firm in Boston. I've been based there for the last 5.5 years. But prior to that, worked in the consumer sector, both Staples and Panera in my career.
Oh, no kidding. Wow. And then how did you bridge into game design? Have you always been a board gamer, or is this something more recent for you, or?
I've loved board games since I was a kid. So
Yeah.
always big into it, really big into strategy games. Those were my favorite. So that's been like a lifelong passion. But once I had kids, I kind of stepped away from it. But then it was about 8 years ago, a friend of mine bought a board game that got me back into it. And now it's become like a huge hobby. And that is what kicked me into actually taking a crack at designing games.
What was the board game they bought you?
I still think it's honestly probably the best one I've ever played. Star Wars Rebellion was my absolute favorite board game.
Interesting.
That was the one that my friend got me on a whim and kind of changed. I can honestly say that changed my hobby life afterwards.
It's funny when people say I had kids and had to get out of it. I think a lot of people would assume you'd get into board games, but the reality is when you have little kids, you're playing Trouble, you're playing maybe Sorry, right? And
yeah, I played a lot of games with them, but they're not those.
yeah, the chunkier games. I have two daughters that are much older now, and still we're just now getting into the Splendors and things at that level with the kind of the gateways. So this is a hobby I think that is very much designed for adults, right? It's kind of our sandbox that we get to play in. And certainly it's a sandbox that I think most of us love. What was the first kind of you got into Star Wars Rebellion? What was it about that game that hooked you? Was it a mechanism? Was it the theme as being a Star Wars fan, or what was it?
Yeah, it was both actually. I mean, the theme I loved being a Star Wars fan, so that was just fun, right?
Yeah.
Is to be able to replay the movies or the story differently every time. But what blew me away was just the variety of the game and the fact that no matter how many times you've played it, and I've played it, I've lost count how many times I've played that game. It's always different. And so I love that aspect of it. It's thematic, it's got these big kind of swings in storyline, but it's also every single game. I don't get tired of it, right? I play it and I know it's going to be different every time I play it, which makes it, I think it's rare that you get a game that's so replayable that you can pick it up at any time and you won't be bored with it.
I guess there's kind of two paths there, isn't there? Isn't there you have the games where it's different every time you play, right? And so it's something new you're discovering. And then on the flip side, you have other games where you kind of get into this, I don't want to say a rut, but you definitely get into kind of a mode where there's a certain way you're going to play it to have the best outcome, right? Splendor would be a good example of that, right? Once you play Splendor enough, you realize there's kind of a certain path you have to take.
Yeah.
And I always know within the first 3 or 4 turns, where am I probably going to land in this game? The other person's going to have to make a mistake based on, just the lay of the cards, right? And I don't know if that's better. I think that's kind of like comfort food, but it's that adventure, I think, that keeps us excited and engaged, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's the beauty of games, right? There's stuff you play just for familiarity, like, oh, that's fun, I'll do that again. And then there's the ones where you're like, oh, I want to do this because I know it's going to be a different challenge this time. I prefer the latter ones because I just think it's a bigger mental challenge. Like, how do I win in this scenario?
Yeah. Were you a
Yeah.
Star Wars nerd as a kid?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I loved it as a kid. And, that's been with me my whole life. And, when the new movies came out and all that, that's when all that interest got rekindled. And like you, I have two daughters, I got them into it. And
Mm.
so that was fun. I think that idea of getting like, you kind of get to relive your childhood through your kids, right?
I,
It
I
was a lot of fun to do that.
I often tell friends the story is I had so when the sequels came out, right? So when we had like the Force Awakens and so forth.
Mm.
Actually, no, I'm even thinking about the prequels. Sorry, this is prequels. I had bought at Walmart. They had like a clearance, and I had bought like this bin full of Star Wars figures, and
Mm.
this is like episode one, right?
Yep.
Episode one, episode two. And so my one daughter got into Star Wars like big time, right? And I
Mm.
was showing her the movies and so forth, and she was playing with my old Star Wars toys. And the one day I'm sitting there watching her play with Star Wars toys, and I said, you know what? Let's make this an epic day. And I took that bin, I opened it
Mm.
up, I brought the stack of games, I said, have at it. And she ripped open all these packages and was sitting there
Mm.
playing with these toys. And I've got friends I'm telling the story to that are just looking at me in absolute horror that I had all these pristine packages that I just let her just go
Yeah.
with, right? But it's the memories. That's what I think most of us Star Wars fans are really kind of attracted
Mm.
to, is that childhood memory. There's always that moment where you're playing with the little figurines and reenacting, and immediately when you see those, it brings you back to that moment and in all those memories. And gosh, that's worth more than
Oh, totally.
reselling a figurine like for four times the cost, like 10, 20
Yeah,
years later, from my perspective.
absolutely. Because your daughter's going to remember that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
then how did you get into like what was the first design thing you did? So like, because
Yeah.
Star Wars Squad, like that's pretty chunky.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Right.
is.
So did you dip your toe in the water and do something a little bit lighter first, or what got you kind of?
No, so actually, what got me into it was one day I had these two buddies of mine that we played Star Wars Rebellion a lot
Yeah.
with their at window, and I said, this would be really cool if someone made a Clone Wars version of this game, and they were like, yeah, that'd be awesome. And then I said, well, I'll just take a crack at doing that, and so that was the actual first like design game from scratch, other than some games I designed for my kids, which were much
Yeah.
basic. And so I made a Clone Wars version using the game dynamics of Rebellion. So that was a ton of fun. And we played that a lot. It was a slightly different game. And actually, the core mechanics of that, we can talk about later, became the mechanics for the Lone Wolf game.
Interesting.
But that was the first one that I created. And I created another derivation that was a three-player because we could never play the three of us. And
Mhm.
I did one that was also Star Wars themed, which was the last Star Wars themed thing I did, which was a Knights of the Old Republic game where you play Jedi, Sith, and Underworld. So you have three factions there.
Oh, that's cool.
So that was fun. But that's how I first got into like heavier game design.
And did you take that to like cons at all, or is it just for you and your buddies? Like,
No, this was just when I first started doing this. This was literally just for me and gaming groups. I had a couple, but these two
yeah,
guys got me into Rebellion. And at first, it was just that. And over time, I was like, they were encouraging me. They're like, you should commercialize this. I said, well, all right, this is Star Wars. It's a license. I can't really pursue that. And I've been a huge fantasy buff since I was a kid. That's actually my bigger kind of passion
hmm
versus. And I said, you know what? I'm going to start to branch out and do my own thing and explore some fantasy themed stuff that I completely kind of created from scratch. And that was the first time I ventured into, other types of games, like fantasy themed games, but still strategy. And that is what eventually led me to say, my friends were telling me, like, you should try to commercialize this. You should try to do a Kickstarter, do that. And I said, all right, well, that sounds interesting. I will explore that. And in 2023, I did that. And I started the research phase of it and then pulled back after I recognized just how much that would involve. Because I got close to pulling the trigger on it just as an independent project.
oh wow,
and I pulled back. But then we can get into this as to how I ended up doing this project that just funded. But that was the start of it, was exploring it, researching it, understanding the process, talking to people in the industry, manufacturers, the crowdfunding,
Yeah.
like Kickstarter and GameFound, and just learning the space for better part of a year back then.
Were you into D&D at all? Like, I'm curious because fantasy, and anytime I talk to people that do fantasy, often have a D&D background as well, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't actually play D&D. I did a lot of D&D types of like more computer game
Okay.
role playing games. Lone Wolf, which we'll talk about, is
Yep.
a role playing game book. So I love that, but I never actually played D&D. I was into strategy board games. So back then, like, started with something like Risk, but Axis and Allies was one of my absolute favorites when I
Yeah,
was,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that
yeah,
one's a bit chunky too, right? You
yeah.
can that could be an entire day, right? If you're playing with the right people.
And it was, yeah, there was a group of us that played, that's like up to a five-player game.
Yeah.
And I love that game. I
Oh
mean,
my
I
god.
memorized like the setup of that game after a while in my head. So it was a lot of fun.
And then, so how did you meet the Lone Wolf group? Like, was it just you were in love with the books and then you just sought them out, or how did that kind of come together?
Yeah. So for folks who don't know Lone Wolf, by the way, so
Yeah.
it was first written in 1984 by Joe Deaver, who was a D&D guy. He was one of the first champions of the U.S. competition back in like the 70s, right?
Yeah.
So he was big into this stuff. He created this world called Lone Wolf. It's set in this planet called Magnum. It's got like this intensely immersive history. He wrote like 18,000 years of history, every country, every region, languages, all this stuff. I got introduced to it. I was 9 years old at a book fair, fourth grade in my elementary school. Just noticed the cover, thought it looked cool. I was into choose your own adventures, but this was like an RPG choose your own adventure.
Yeah.
And so I picked it up and I just loved it. And so I followed that series. Back then there was no internet. So you just went to the bookstore
Yeah.
waiting for, seeing if the books came out. And I read every book as it came out. The first 20 were published in the US. It went to like 28 in the UK. He's a British author. But I love these books. They were so formative for me as a kid. I loved fantasy. I loved role playing like in this world. And like you talked about the memories of,
Yeah.
when you're a kid, you can't replace. That's what this was for me. This was like one of my biggest passions. It inspired me to write. I always wanted to be a writer. I wrote fantasy. If I look back, I can trace the stuff I wrote, like ideas that came out of, his books.
Yeah.
But bottom line is like that was a lifelong passion. It still always had been the top shelf of my bookshelf, like my whole life, right? And then in 2024, so yeah, January of almost 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
This author, by the way, had passed away, right?
Oh
And
wow.
he never finished the series, unfortunately. He passed it to his son, though, Ben, and he entrusted Ben with the brand, the history, the company, and he wanted him to finish the series, like to book 32. And the son took it over and kind of tried to relaunch the brand, like redo all the books, like rejuvenate the brand after so many years. And he had an open call for an anthology for people to submit stories, right? And so I did that because I always wanted to be a writer, and I said, you know what, I'll take a crack at this. And I submitted a couple stories to it, and one of them got selected,
No way.
which was awesome, right? So I've had this bucket list, thing of I want to like publish a book or a piece of fiction, and I want to make a board game. Those were two bucket list, things that I had. And so this put me in touch with Ben, and it enabled that first one. And I said, all right, well, I've been developing games like on my own with the intent of maybe someday commercializing them. And when I got selected, I'm like, you know what? I want to make a Lone Wolf themed game. I don't care if I make it or not. Like, I just got inspired. I've been doing a game a year for like the past 8 years at this point, right? So I decided, like, all right, I'm going to take a crack at this one. And I did, created it, started to play test it. Same group that had got me into this stuff, right? That we love playing these games. And I reached out to Ben. I said, hey, would you be interested in this idea of a lone wolf themed strategy game, right? And I sent him the pictures, the prototype, an overview of it, and he was like, "All right." He wasn't expecting that, right?
Yeah.
I think when he saw that fleshed out, he was very interested. I didn't know at the time he was trying to get Holmgard Games, a subsidiary, kind of off the ground and launch a pipeline of new products. And this hit at the right time for him. And he said, "Let's talk about how to do this." And then that was late 24, kind of the last back half of 24. And then at the end of the year, we said, so it's been actually, it was a year ago, almost to the month, where he said, "Let's do this." And so we came to an agreement of how we were going to do that. And then we launched the effort. And since January up until now, it was, okay, we've got the game design and the prototype. Now we've got to actually reskin this whole thing, because I was using art from 40 years of Lone Wolf, but it was by a lot of different artists, right?
Yeah.
And we had to sculpt the miniatures. We had to, redo all the art. There's like over 150 pieces of art in this thing. And we, that was that effort. And then we said, let's launch a crowdfunding campaign, which we did. Then we had to align on the timing, and we launched that in September. And that successfully funded, thankfully. And now we're in like the production process with the manufacturer. So
this is a crazy story. Like, I just trying to think back to like for the listeners, think back to something that inspired you in your childhood, right?
Yeah.
And then say, okay, now fast forward 20 some odd years that you're now part of that and actively contributing to that thing that inspired you. Like, that is
It's
such
a
a rare thing, right?
It honestly is such a dream. If you ask me at any point from when I was 9 to whenever that, hey, you might someday write something that's canon in this world that you loved and get to create a game set in it, I'd be like, well, that's never going to happen. Right?
That's insane.
But yeah, and it's just honestly pure luck. Like, I submitted it's because of the submission of the story, and then got selected, that he was willing to, because he gets submitted stuff all the time by all sorts of people. But because I had gotten the story submitted, he knew who I at least was, and I think that made him open to the possibility of doing it.
So for some of those story elements, were you able to incorporate those into Vengeance of
Oh
the Kai?
yeah, oh yeah. The game itself, there's 20 now. There's about to be the 32nd book is going to come out in February, right? So there's so many books and so much history. What I did is I decided I'm going to focus on the parts I love the most. Like, this was actually for me a lot of fun. It's like, all right, as a fan, what game would I want to make? That I love. Let's do that. But the story lends itself, because the first 12 books, and we can get into this, is like a complete arc. That's one of the things that made these books cool. It was like the character carried over, and you were crafting the history of this world as you went, right? And you're the hero of it. But the first 12 books were a very kind of cool cycle of events and a story arc. And so what I did is I, created a game wrapped around that, taking some other elements from other books as well. But the core of it is you're writing your version of the first 12 books, much the same way, honestly. Like, if you've played like War of the Ring or Rebellion as an example, it's like the books and the movies in a box. That's what this is, and you get to play it out. But the ending is different every single time. That's something I really wanted to do, is emulate that like total replayability of the game.
I gotta believe that, like, with the amount of history that this series has, that there's an inherent audience you guys would be able to tap into as part of this.
Totally.
Even the pre-marketing for this. Was there a lot of collaboration in that regards with Holmgard in terms of tapping into that existing audience that's already there?
Yeah, that actually is what kind of convinced me to do this, because, like I mentioned, I looked at doing an independent game back in 23, and I was like, well, I've got no IP, no fan base, like I've got to build. I said, here, there's a really unique opportunity. There are people who are very passionate. You talk about this, like, the audience is folks of our age, right? They grew up in kind of the 80s and 90s. They love these books, the childhood memories of this book, right? Of the books. They're still out there. the book sold 12 million plus copies worldwide. So this was a pretty wide base. Now, a lot of those people moved on and, they're not as engaged, but there is a core that was. And so that's what gave me a lot of confidence to say, okay, this is an established world. It's an established IP, has an active fan base that's engaged in new content that Ben is putting out.
Yeah.
And when we saw it, by the way, in the data, when we ran the campaign, because I watched this daily and picked it apart, like what's going on. Anytime we did anything through Holmgard, like through its social media or marketing or whatnot, that had the biggest impact. So the bulk of our backers were Lone Wolf fans. Folks like you and I who grew up with it and who were trying to get their kids into it. Like we heard a lot of those stories like, oh, this game I'm going to play with my kids and, get them into the world.
As kind of an overview or kind of a, connecting that thread to just, crowdfunding in general. Your current audience is always going to be you're the largest kind of carryover into the next campaign you do, whether that be your email list. And I always talk on this podcast about the importance of building that email list, or even, tapping into prior campaigns and doing updates in those campaigns to say, hey, we've got another campaign on this other game. There's always going to be a chunk of your audience that is just, bought into, what you're putting out there, and they want to continue to, be part of that journey. Is so important to cultivate that, that following.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like how to play this game for those who maybe are new to this or maybe heard the Lone Wolf series, but maybe haven't been introduced to the game? Like, what's the essence of what this game is about and how you'd play it?
Yeah. So at its core, it's a two-player asymmetrical strategy game, right? So you're taking on the role of either the good guys, Lone Wolf, and the kind of the Freeland Alliance, which are the nations that are opposed to the forces of darkness, which are the Dark Lords and their allies. So those are the two sides. I'm a huge fan of the asymmetrical kind of style of game. And so one of the things about the asymmetry is you're pursuing different objectives, right? So as the good guys, you are trying to replicate what happened in the books, which is you are on a quest. You're fulfilling Lone Wolf's quests, right? To achieve certain levels of ability and power so you can ultimately destroy the Dark Lords, right? You have to, in the meantime, prevent their victory, right? So it's highly, highly unlikely you will militarily be able to dominate them because you start weaker. You have to basically hold the line, buy time for Lone Wolf to fulfill his quests. And the Dark Lords are trying to, through military means primarily, conquer 5 of 9 of the Freeland capitals, critical mass, where they basically declare victory and they've won the war. So you've got the pressure of the war happening on the Dark Lord side. You've got Lone Wolf with his quests, and a cool dynamic that I wanted to interject into this was what happens in the books. Lone Wolf gets stronger and stronger as he completes his quest. So the kind of initially you feel weak and you can't take on the Dark Lords, but later you flip the table completely and they're afraid of you, right? Towards the end. And so every single action in the game is like, do I pursue my agenda or do I try to slow my opponent? And the trick is to find that balance, because if you do one or the other too much, you won't win, right? And it's also about keeping the opponent from achieving some key objectives in there. So it's the kind of game where after you're done, you will replay in your head all the choices you made. And you'll be, I should have done that differently. Yeah. But it's also where it can be different every single time, which is what I wanted. But the core dynamics are very similar to games like the games I love, War of the Ring, Rebellion, Dune, War for Arrakis. Like there's very much leader-based actions. There's a lot of action on the table in terms of a map with armies and things like that. But between moving armies and conducting battles or conducting, actions or missions or whatever you want to call them, that's the flow of the action in the game.
A lot of minis in this too. Like I was just showing on screen while you're chatting, like these minis look sick. Like they look so good. Is that part of is that like an expansion to get the minis, or is that or is that like it comes with the minis? If
Oh no, they're core to the game. There's a total of 215 miniatures across 15 different sculpts.
Oh yeah, they're so
Um,
cool.
and they are your armies. So they're on the board, and they are key class types, if you
Mm.
will, from the books, right? So anyone who's read the books will look at these, and be like, oh, I recognize those guys, and some of them are very well loved characters. But that's what made it fun for me is like some of them for the first time are being like created in a physical form like that. So for
Yeah.
fans, it's oh, I finally get the Vakaros as an example. There's finally a figure of a Vakaros, right? So.
Now I know in the intro I did mention that this is this it's in late pledge mode right now. I've got it at I don't know if this is Canadian or U.S. dollars, $152,000. 1,130 backers. So very successful campaign. People can still back this. I think you were saying just before we went on air though, like that's limited though, right? Like when does that end? The late pledge.
Yeah, the late pledge, it's tied to right now. We're in kind of the pre-production process with
Yeah.
manufacturers. And as soon as we nail down and say go on production, that's when it'll end. And that's targeted for mid to late January. So there's about 2+ weeks left when folks will still be able to pledge.
Yeah, I'll make sure I'll put a link in the show notes so if people want to check it out. It is on GameFound. I know we cover a lot of Kickstarters on this podcast as well. What was the decision to go with GameFound?
Yeah, well, we had a big debate on that. And I think a lot of game companies and developers debate which one. And
Yeah.
so the general gist that we came away with was Kickstarter has a broader general audience, right? And better suited for, I think, more simpler games that are easier to enter, more mass appeal, generally lower price point, which will also link to less componentry, less miniatures in many cases, but kind of mass market kind of appeal. GameFound takeaway we had was more serious gamers into more complex, larger scale games. Definitely a skew towards heavy miniature games
Yeah.
and fantasy games. And so when we looked at it, we said, all right, well, this game is definitely a heavier game. It's not a for a first time gamer, it's probably not the best thing that you could pick up. But we said, all right, with that, it fits there. And a lot of our backers, we didn't know how many, but percent wise, would come from the Lone Wolf fan base, and they'd go wherever we drove them, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, where are we going to get more new fans to come in?
Mm-hmm.
And appeal to gamers, which we thought this would really appeal to. And that's what drove us to the GameFound choice.
Yeah, I echo those statements. I think that I've attempted to launch a game on GameFound. We end up pulling it after a couple of days, but it definitely seems like, and I mean, Tin Robot Games, my company, focuses a lot on gateway games, right, and more that casual kind of family weight type games. Kickstarter is definitely the platform for that. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas I think GameFound, you can do some really big numbers on GameFound, but I think from my experience, you really need to bring the audience, right? So Kickstarter is more you bring the audience, but there's a discovery element to it based on the size of their audience. GameFound is more heavier type games. And more you have to bring the audience from my experience, but certainly you guys made the right call because you funded it and you funded quite high, right? So it worked out well for you. What's like, are you going to continue on with the series or what's next? Like, are you working on other games like as part of your kind of design journey or like, what's your plan?
Well, for Holmgard Games, there's actually now, this was the first crowdfunding campaign and the first game in Holmgard Games arsenal, so or collection. So this has opened the door now to what's next, right? And so there's definitely there's an expansion that we have already kind of drafted out for Lone Wolf, the Vengeance of the Kai. So
nice.
That's like the no-brainer immediate thing we could do, because the game will hit will hit shelves for distribution and get to backers kind of Q2 of this year of 26. So timing would be great to do an expansion right around there. there is another plot set within this world of another character that could lend itself to another strategy game, which I've actually already sketched out, need to play test, but that one I loved as well. So that's another option. But the core of this, if you really look at the books, they are solo RPG books. And in these books, there's all sorts of different settings. There's everything from dungeon crawls to battles, which lend themselves to RPG dungeon crawl game, as well as skirmish games. And so there's actually there's more than enough ideas to drive years worth of products within those two. And so for Holmgard Games, that's kind of what we're looking at, is a series of RPG based kind of dungeon crawls, an RPG based world that you can open world kind of thing, where you can do something a little bit more like, kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons deal. There is skirmish, like battle type games, like tactical battle games. And then there are more strategy games, like I talked about. So for Holmgard Games, a ton. For me personally, outside of Holmgard Games, and I'd love to continue to partner, with Holmgard Games on these things, is there are these other games I created that I debated doing, a few years ago, that I would love someday to create. So they're two fantasy themed games that one of which has a very unique dynamic that I was really setting out to do that I'd love to introduce someday. That one I've prototyped, we've game tested. It's kind of like, think of like Twilight Imperium, but in a fantasy world, right? Wow. Yeah. And so that's very intense. That one's called Favor of the Gods, but it's this idea of you're currying favor, and there are 5 gods, and you can go deep on one god and become more powerful. The more favor you get, the more powerful you become, and it's all about who becomes the greatest through favor with all these gods. I personally love that game. It is very complex. There's some stuff I still need to work out, but I'd love to someday do that one. So.
Nice. Well, for this one, again, I'm going to put a link in the show notes. I encourage people to check it out. It looks super cool, and I mean, I think your journey is so inspiring, and certainly for those out there, I think it's a message to say, hey, if there's something you're passionate about, keep chasing it, right? Because you never know. Things sometimes just connect, right? And it can happen. So I want to wish you all the best, Dan, and I can't wait to see what you come up with next, my friend.
Awesome. Thank you very much, James. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
No worries, buddy. You take care. Cheers. This has been an episode of the Board Game Binge podcast, hosted by James Staley, produced by James Staley and Mike Bruner, with original music by Nick Smith. If you would like to watch these interviews live, simply subscribe to our YouTube channel, Board Game Binge, and you'll get access to live interviews, giveaways, and interesting board game content from across the industry. I can't wait for you to join us. See you next time.